Today's program features Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. The program begins with an 18-minute TED Talks video. Then, Buddy Burke will introduce Lisa, and we will pivot to Q&A.
My research lab sits about a mile from where several bombs exploded during the Boston Marathon in 2013. The surviving bomber, Zakhar Tsarnaev of Chechnya, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Now, when a jury has to make the decision between life in prison and the death penalty, they base their decision largely on whether or not the defendant feels remorseful for his actions. Tsarnaev spoke words of apology, but when jurors looked at his face, all they saw was a stone-faced stare. Now, Tsarnaev is guilty. There's no doubt about that. He murdered and maimed innocent people, and I'm not here to debate that. My heart goes out to all the people who suffered. But as a scientist, I have to tell you that jurors do not and cannot detect remorse or any other emotion in anybody ever. Neither can I, and neither can you. And that's because emotions are not what we think they are. They are not universally expressed and recognized. They are not hardwired brain reactions that are uncontrollable. We have misunderstood the nature of emotion for a very long time, and understanding what emotions really are have important consequences for all of us. I have studied emotions as a scientist for the past 25 years, and in my lab, we have probed human faces by measuring electrical signals that cause your facial muscles to contract to make facial expressions. We have scrutinized the human body in emotion. We have analyzed hundreds of physiology studies involving thousands of test subjects. We've scanned hundreds of brains and examined every brain imaging study on emotion that has been published in the past 20 years. And the results of all of this research is overwhelmingly consistent. It may feel to you like your emotions are hardwired and they just trigger and happen to you, but they don't. You might believe that your brain is pre-wired with emotion circuits, that you're born with emotion circuits, but you're not. In fact, none of us in this room have emotion circuits in our brain. In fact, no brain on this planet contains emotion circuits. So what are emotions really? Well, strap on your seatbelt, because emotions are guesses. They are guesses that your brain constructs in the moment where billions of brain cells are working together. And you have more control over those guesses than you might imagine that you do. Now, if that sounds preposterous to you or, kind of crazy, I'm right there with you, because frankly, if I hadn't seen the evidence for myself, decades of evidence for myself, I am fairly sure that I wouldn't believe it either. But the bottom line is that emotions are not built into your brain at birth. They are just built. To see what I mean, have a look at this. Right now, your brain is working like crazy. Your neurons are firing like mad, trying to make meaning out of this so that you see something other than black and white blobs. Your brain is sifting through a lifetime of experience, making thousands of guesses at the same time, weighing the probabilities, trying to answer the question, what is this most like? Not what is it, but what is this most like in my past experience? And this is all happening in the blink of an eye. Now, if your brain is still struggling to find a good match and you still see black and white blobs, then you are in a state called experiential blindness. And I am going to cure you of your blindness. This is my favorite part. Are you ready to be cured? All right, here we go. All right. So now, many of you see a snake. And why is that? Because as your brain is sifting through your past experience, there's new knowledge there, the knowledge that came from the photograph. And what's really cool is that that knowledge, which you just acquired moments ago, is changing how you experience these blobs right now. So your brain is constructing the image of a snake where there is no snake. And this kind of a hallucination is what neuroscientists like me call predictions. Predictions are basically the way your brain works. It's business as usual for your brain. Predictions are the basis of every experience that you have. They are the basis of every action that you take. In fact, predictions are what allow you to understand the words that I'm speaking as they come out of my mouth. Exactly. Predictions are primal, right? They help us to make sense of the world in a quick and efficient way. So, your brain does not react to the world. Using past experience, your brain predicts and constructs your experience of the world. The way that we see emotions in others are deeply rooted in predictions, right? So to us, it feels like we just look at someone's face and we just read the emotion that's there in their facial expressions the way that we would read words on a page. But actually, under the hood, your brain is predicting. It's using past experience based on similar situations to try to make meaning. This time, you're not making meaning of blobs, you're making meaning of facial movements, like the curl of a lip or the raise of an eyebrow. And that stone-faced stare? Well, that might be someone who is a remorseless killer. But a stone-faced stare might also mean that someone is stoically accepting defeat, which is in fact what Chechen culture prescribes for someone in Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's situation. So the lesson here is that emotions that you seem to detect in other people actually come in part from what's inside your own head. And this is true in the courtroom, but it's also true in the classroom, in the bedroom, and in the boardroom. And so here's my concern. Tech companies, which shall remain nameless, well, maybe not, Google, Facebook, are spending millions of research dollars to build emotion detection systems. And they are fundamentally asking the wrong question because they're trying to detect emotions in the face and the body. But emotions aren't in your face and body. Physical movements have no intrinsic emotional meaning. We have to make them meaningful. A human or something else has to connect them to the context, and that makes them meaningful. That's how we know that, a smile might mean sadness, and a cry might mean happiness, and a stoic, still face might mean that you are angrily plotting the demise of your enemy. Now, if I haven't already, gone out on a limb, I'll just edge out on that limb a little further and tell you that the way that you experience your own emotion is exactly the same process. Your brain is basically making predictions, guesses, that it's constructing in the moment with billions of neurons working together. Now, your brain does come pre-wired to make some feelings. Right? Simple feelings that come from the physiology of your body. So when you're born, you can make feelings like calmness and agitation, excitement, comfort, discomfort. But these simple feelings are not emotions. They're actually with you every waking moment of your life. They are simple summaries of what's going on inside your body, kind of like a barometer. But they have very little detail, and you need that detail to know what to do next. What do you do about these feelings? And so how does your brain give you that detail? Well, that's what predictions are. Predictions link the sensations in your body that give you these simple feelings with what's going on around you in the world so that you know what to do. And sometimes those constructions are emotions. So, for example, if you were to walk into a bakery, your brain might predict that you will encounter the delicious aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. I know my brain would predict the delicious aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, and our brains might cause our stomachs to churn a little bit to prepare for eating those cookies. And if we are correct, if in fact some cookies have just come out of the oven, then our brains will have constructed hunger, and we are prepared to munch down those cookies and digest them in a very efficient way, meaning that we can eat a lot of them, which would be a really good thing. You guys aren't not laughing enough. I'm totally serious. This is really... But here's the thing. That churning stomach, if it occurs in a different situation, it can have a completely different meaning. So if your brain were to predict a churning stomach in, say, a hospital room while you're waiting for test results, then your brain will be constructing dread or worry or anxiety. And it might cause you to maybe wring your hands or take a deep breath or even cry. Right? Same physical sensations, same churning stomach, different experience. And so the lesson here is that emotions which seem to happen to you are actually made by you. You are not at the mercy of mythical emotion circuits which are buried deep inside some ancient part of your brain. You have more control over your emotions than you think you do. I don't mean that you can just snap your fingers and, change how you feel the way that you would change your clothes. But your brain is wired so that if you change the ingredients that your brain uses to make emotion, then you can transform your emotional life. So if you change those ingredients today, you're basically teaching your brain how to predict differently tomorrow. And this is what I call being the architect of your experience. So here's an example. All of us have had a nervous feeling before a test, right? But some people experience crippling anxiety before a test. They have test anxiety. Based on past experiences of taking tests, their brains predict a hammering heartbeat, sweaty hands, so much so that they are unable to actually take the test. They don't perform well, and sometimes they not only fail courses, but they actually might fail college. But here's the thing. A hammering heartbeat is not necessarily anxiety. It could be that your body is preparing to do battle and ace that test. Or, give a talk in front of hundreds of people on a stage where you're being filmed. I'm serious. And research shows that when students learn to make determination, right, this kind of energized determination instead of anxiety, they perform better on tests. And that determination seeds their brain to predict differently in the future so that they can get their butterflies flying in formation. And if they do that often enough, they not only can pass a test, but it'll be easier for them to pass their courses, and they might even finish college, which has a huge impact on their future earning potential. So I call this emotional intelligence in action. Now, you can cultivate this emotional intelligence yourself and use it in your everyday life. So just, imagine waking up in the morning. I'm sure you've had this experience. I know I have. You wake up in the morning, and as you're emerging into consciousness, you feel this horrible dread, this real wretchedness. And immediately your mind starts to race, right? You start to think about all the crap that you have to do at work and that mountain of email, which you will never dig yourself out of, ever, right? And the phone calls you have to return and that important meeting that you have across town, and you're going to have to fight traffic to get there, which means you're going to be late picking your kids up, and your dog is sick, and what are you going to make for dinner? And oh my God, right? What is wrong with your life? What's wrong with my life? That mind racing is prediction. Your brain is searching to find an explanation for those sensations in your body that you experience as as wretchedness, just like you did with the blobby image. So your brain is trying to explain what caused those sensations so that you know what to do about them. But those sensations might not be an indication that anything is wrong with your life. They might have a purely physical cause. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you didn't sleep enough. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you're dehydrated. The next time that you feel intense distress, ask yourself, could this have a purely physical cause? Is it possible that you can transform emotional suffering into just mere physical discomfort? Now, I am not suggesting to you that you can just perform a couple of Jedi mind tricks and then, talk yourself out of being depressed or anxious or any kind of serious condition. But I am telling you that you have more control over your emotions than you might imagine, and that you have the capacity to turn down the dial on emotional suffering and its consequences for your life by learning how to construct your experiences differently. And all of us can do this, and with a little practice, we can get really good at it. Like driving. At first, it takes a lot of effort, but eventually, it becomes pretty automatic. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this to be a really empowering and inspiring message. And the fact that it's backed up by decades of research makes me also happy as a scientist. But I have to also warn you that it does come with some fine print, because more control also means more responsibility. If you are not at the mercy of mythical emotion circuits, which are buried deep inside your brain somewhere and which trigger automatically, then who's responsible? Who's responsible when you behave badly? You are. Not because you're culpable for your emotions, but because the actions and the experiences that you make today become your brain's predictions for tomorrow. Sometimes we are responsible for something not because we're to blame, but because we're the only ones who can change it. Now, responsibility is a big word. It's so big, in fact, that sometimes people feel the need to resist the scientific evidence that emotions are built and not built in. The idea that we are responsible for our own emotions seems, very hard to swallow. But what I'm suggesting to you is you don't have to choke on that idea. You just take a deep breath, maybe get yourself a glass of water if you need to, and embrace it. Embrace that responsibility, because it is the path to a healthier body, a more just and informed legal system, and a more flexible and potent emotional life. Thank you.
Our speaker is University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northwestern University, with appointments at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. She's among the top 1% most cited scientists for revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. She is the recipient of an NIH Director's Pioneer Award for Transformative Research and a former president of the American Psychological Association. She has testified before the U.S. Congress, is the Chief Science Officer for the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at MGH, that's Mass General, and actively encourages in informal science education for the public via popular books, articles, and public lectures. She has authored 2 popular science books for the public: How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain, and more recently, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Whereas we've all now seen her consequential TED Talk video, one of the most viewed of all time, it's now our chance to dig a little deeper into the genesis of our emotions. So let's manufacture an emotional welcome for Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Good morning, and thank you for taking our questions.
Sure.
It's a little daunting to be asking a question of someone with your experience. However, allow me to start with a story. I've watched your video twice now. So Henry Ford asked 100 people, hey, I want to invent something where you can take the kids to school, run over to the hardware store, drop back and get back home, no sweat. 99 out of 100 people said, Henry, that's an easy question. Just invent a faster horse. Your idea of the mind works on predictions. I find that when I speak to people, like 99 out of 100 shut me off before I even get to the punchline. Before I get to tell my story, I feel predicted, and it's a little depressing actually. So I have one thing that I've stumbled into, and that is in my presentation, I tell people what it's not. And I would, before they predict, I say, this is what it's not. I just wondered if you would just ramble on about, am I rambling? Or
Yeah, you're rambling.
That's my question. Sorry.
Well, I think that what's interesting about, there's a couple of things that are interesting about your comment, Brian. One is that when you say to people, when I introduce these findings, and I should say this isn't an idea, it's actually a hypothesis that's backed up by thousands of studies at this point. And it's not my idea alone, not my hypothesis alone. There are a number of scientists working on the actual mechanisms by which brains predict. And of course, we're a bunch of scientists, so there's always going to be some disagreement about the actual mechanisms. If we all agreed on everything, we'd all be out of a job. So, but there are really thousands of scientists at this point. I don't think that's hyperbole, working on trying to better understand how the brain predicts mechanistically and what that means. But I think your story is interesting because when I first say to people, well, it feels to us like we just look at something or we hear something and then we react to it. But really we're predicting. That sounds kind of crazy. But then very quickly people start to tell stories, anecdotes about things that they've experienced that really resonates. Their intuition starts to really resonate with the idea that brains are predicting rather than reacting. I think the thing that's hard for people to understand, it's really hard for me to understand. It's hard for me to believe. If I hadn't seen the data myself, I don't sure I would believe it, that predictions begin as motor predictions. So when your brain is making a prediction about the next moment, it's predicting what should happen inside your body in order to support certain actions, physical actions. And the predictions of what you see and what you hear and what you smell and what you feel are a consequence of those motor predictions. So it's not like you see something and then you act because you see it. It's that your brain is preparing your actions, and because of that preparation, which you're not aware of at all, you see certain things and you hear certain things. And there are some really lovely examples. For example, in my book, in How Emotions Are Made, I use an example of baseball. I explain baseball, why baseball couldn't possibly exist as a game without prediction, without a predicting brain. And that really what's happening between a batter and a pitcher is this like battle of predictive wits, if you will. And this is also true in soccer. It's really true in any kind of coordinated game. So to me, I still find it fascinating that really the brain is organized for action, for regulating the body, and our experience of the world and of each other, is a consequence of that, not a stimulus of it.
David, let's go.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your informative talk. Just a couple of quick questions. If predictions are emotions, how do emotions relate to gut instinct?
Well, David, I would say that everything your brain does pretty much is by prediction, not just emotions, but every thought, every action you take, everything you see, everything you hear. By gut instinct, you could mean a couple of different things, and I'm not sure which one you mean. So I'm gonna try to answer both versions of what I think you might mean. One possibility of what you might mean is that sometimes it feels like you're doing things by reflex, where you have no control over what happens, or, you know, like you'll see an animal kind of do something out of reflex, like as a reflex, maybe protectively to protect against threat or something. That's a situation where the brain makes a prediction. Now, normally, let me back up and say, normally what the brain is doing is it's making predictions, and then the sense data that come to the brain through the sensory surfaces of your body, your eyes, your ears, your skin, and so on, your brain is checking its predictions against those sense data. And the sense data are there to either confirm the predictions or to correct them, which we have a fancy name for correcting predictions. We call it learning. That's what learning is. And so what if you have a gut instinct and meaning you react without thinking or what have you, that's your brain is executed a prediction, and it hasn't waited. It's not waiting to check the sense data against its prediction. It just executes the action. And this is what you see happening, for example, when say, and this is an inference, but it's backed up by data from our lab and other labs, when a police officer sees a gun where there is no gun. Or, for example, the police officer who drew her gun instead of a taser. She thought she was drawing a taser, but she actually drew a gun. What happened there was her brain predicted something and executed the action without checking the sense data. So there was no time for correction. And oftentimes I think people have the experience of seeing something and then they look again and they see something different. And that's like a very similar situation. But if by gut feeling you mean literally a gut instinct, you mean a gut feeling like you should be doing this versus that. You know, you should be a gut feeling or gut instinct to avoid something or approach something. Like every time I see a bowl of potato chips, I have a gut instinct to eat those potato chips. You know, despite my my understanding of what would be actually healthier for me to do. And that is very explainable by the normal process of prediction. So predictions begin. So if we were to stop time right now and peer into your brain would be predicting, that is starting to prepare the changes inside your body, changing your heart rate, changing your blood pressure, changing your breathing rate, changing your glucose, the amount of glucose being metabolized in certain cells. It'd be preparing those things in advance of the actual action that you're about to take. And it's also preparing the expected sensory consequences. So what you will feel in a moment from now. So your brain actually begins to prepare your feeling for the next moment well before you feel it. And then by the time you're aware of it, it feels like it just turned on like a light switch, but actually there's been, you know, neural stuff going on in the background in the works, preparing things. So basically, if you saw a snake, you're taking a walk in the woods and you saw a snake, to you, it would feel like you had a gut reaction to just hightail it out of there. But really what's happened is the rustling of the leaves and so on would be causing your brain to start predicting the various things that could have caused those rustling of leaves and prepare the actual physical changes that need to happen to keep you safe. And upon the first sense data that confirms those predictions, they're executed and you have a feeling and you hightail it out of there. So to you, it feels like you're having a gut instinct and you're reacting to it, but that's actually not what's happening in your brain at all.
Okay, so we'll go to Jim Margraf, who's on Zoom, excuse me. On mute, hopefully not. Jim?
Great, thank you, Lisa. Lisa, I'm completely taken with your book. Reading it a second time with particular interest in chapter 5 on concepts, goals, and words. And also I shared your TED Talk just yesterday for simultaneous viewing with my company for everyone at all hands meeting. So thanks so much for your
Oh,
work.
that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for that.
So I've been looking forward to speaking. So I have some background, a premise, and then 3 fairly deep questions. So if you could bear with me as I set this up, I think the context will help. So background, so I'm a serial entrepreneur and inventor. One of my inventions helped 100 million kids around the world learn to read. It was called the Leapfrog LeapPad.
Oh yeah, wow, that's so cool.
Thank you. So another tool was, this ties together, another tool was a tool to help you cycle between writing, reading, speaking, and listening to help with memory and learning. It's called a Smart Pen, a LiveScribe. And most recently was a form of wearable eye tracking with an eye interface for AR and VR that lets you interact by controlling with your eyes. That is sold to Google 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
So I love learning, thinking, emotion, and brain development. And I'm now working on a tool to improve human connection that involves AI and AR and asynchronous support between parties that are all integrated in some new form of video chat. So those are the elements. Mm-hmm. So the premise that ties decades of this developments together, and your book reading this is helping me clarify it. So thanks again. So it deals with the development of human thought and emotion, our speed of thinking, and our problem solving capabilities. So here's the premise. So I think we could create a brain machine interface with an AI agent and multisensory control, which is key, which includes eye tracking, that could provide a new form of dynamic language. And if the AI were to be attuned to your knowledge with a visual interface, it could communicate concepts, not as words, but with a new form of visual representation that could involve goal-based, context-sensitive concepts. That it could be more efficient than this archaic mode we have of character and phonetic-based language. It could be something that could advance fundamentally human thought and our understanding of emotion. So elements, again, a BMI with an AI agent involving eye tracking and eye interaction that supports a new form of language, that's a visual language, that's dynamic by tracking your eyes and your various forms of input that advances the way we think. So as you know, saccadic motions, the fastest moving part of our eyes are the fastest moving part of our body. And I did work in this looking at how you can create an interface with eyes as well that could be tuned in. So I think the impact could be as profound as the introduction of writing to our species. We are just at a point where there's technology that could let us do this in a way that hasn't been done. So questions? Yeah, there we go.
I'm curious to understand, to be able to answer your question. So what type of visual symbols would it be symbols that you're using, or what would you?
It's great, you got it. It would be dynamic, and yes, they would be symbols. And because, as you know, right now the processing of information through this, crazy language, we read, we translate, we turn it into sound. Of course, we recognize these patterns, but to be able to provide a pattern that's dynamically presented, and to be able to move your eyes with this pattern on a screen is something I've not seen. And we experimented with this at Google, and it's pretty profound what happens because you can move one's eyes around without them knowing it. And,
sure, actually, you don't even have to saccade to shift your focus of attention, which is called covert attention, basically, where you keep your eyes focused, but you I'm just saying this more for the rest of the listeners, but you can move the focus of your attention without, you can move it to the periphery, for example, of what you're seeing in the periphery, without actually moving your eyes. So can I just ask one more question? So would this be sort of like, like in Chinese writing or Japanese writing, you actually have a character, and when you speak, there's the meaning of the word. The meaning of that character can change depending on your tonal, the tonal pronunciation, the tonal vocalization. So that's a form of dynamics. It's not visual dynamics, it's acoustical dynamics, where the same sound, the same sound, but with different tone to it, indicates a different meaning, a different word. So are you thinking of something equivalent, but actually visually mediated and very dynamic?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, because understand oral versus visual, and also variance in the understanding. Thinking about the key here is begins with realizing you would need to teach this most likely to an infant, because our brains have evolved. So we have to start when our brains are malleable enough to, and we're still pruning this. So one would need to start with at that age. But the type of symbols I'm looking at, I don't know yet. They could be iconographic, they could be representation, but if you're starting young enough, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that the language is structured. But
Jim, there's a queue of people who have other questions. So we're really excited that we're with the two smartest people we know here. But if you could get to your question, that'd be great.
My question was, have you given any thought to this? And we're having the conversation, so it's evident. So maybe the better question is whether you'd be interested in taking this offline. And I'd love to.
Sure, I'd be very interested to take it offline, but I will just say one thing, because it will be maybe interesting to everyone else too, and that is that little babies, really young babies, their visual system, their auditory system wires itself to its world faster than the visual system does. So 3-month-olds can use sound. They use smell and they use sound. They can use words, actually, just the regularity of the sounds of words to learn an abstract concept, even though they don't know what the words mean, which is a really cool thing. So if you say to a baby, well, actually, we don't have a lot of time, so I won't go into the whole example, but let me just say that babies actually pay attention to regularities in sound. Sight is more difficult. So for a baby, the only reason why babies become experts at faces really quickly, the ability to recognize this as a face is not inborn, it's not genetic. It's just that babies are curated. They have if you hold them and you feed them, as you're feeding them, it's the perfect distance for them to learn what a face is. And so they get 3 intensive months of like a tutorial on what faces are. And within a couple of days, actually, after being born, they can learn faces. So that would be my main thing to think about here, is that we think about an infant's brain as a miniature adult brain, and that infants are born with all the emotions and intentions and so on that a grown-up is, and that's just not the case. An infant brain is a miniature, is a brain waiting for wiring instructions from the world, and those wiring instructions come from the infant's own body and also from the world that we curate for it. But yes, I would be delighted to talk. Yeah.
Thanks. We'll follow up through Buddy. Thank you.
Great.
Good morning, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for being here. Your research is very exciting, and thank you for being here. And so the question I have this morning is about, thinking about what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Afghanistan with all the people being traumatized. I was wondering, those people are going to be experiencing PTSD, a lot of them. And I was wondering, with PTSD, does that then become flawed predictions based upon trauma? And the second part of my question is that we actually have some people from Afghanistan that we are sponsoring and helping out through the club. And what can people like ourselves do to aid these people to be able to help them over the rough spot with the PTSD they most certainly experience? How can we help? Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let me just say a couple of things that, and it's obvious that what's happening in various places, you know, like the Ukraine, Afghanistan, and so on, is a tragedy at large scale. But I think it's important to understand that research suggests that the majority of people who go through adverse events, even something horrific like a war, don't develop PTSD. Actually, they suffer for a month, or for 6 months, or a year, but their functioning is not impaired, meaning they're suffering with you know, feelings, but their actual physical functioning isn't impaired. This is work by George Bonanno. He studied thousands and thousands and thousands of people across many, many, many different types of adversity, including rape, war, 9/11, just many, many things. And the majority of people actually recover, which doesn't mean that they never feel bad or that they never have suffering feelings. It just means that their functioning in their everyday life returns fairly quickly. It's only about 25% of people who actually develop PTSD. The second part of your question, is PTSD flawed predictions? Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. So remember when I said that predictions are always updating themselves, right? Your brain is always updating its predictions by learning new things. Whenever it makes a mistake in prediction, there's an error, prediction error, you have the opportunity to learn that and to be able to predict better the next time. But that learning is very metabolically expensive. And oftentimes when we're dealing with other humans, things are uncertain and it's not so easy to learn the outcome, you know, that there's a lot of guessing involved. And so for a number of reasons, PTSD is an example of someone who is using an old set of predictions in a new environment and they haven't really adjusted yet. And I'm making it sound like it's, just a simple matter of adjusting your predictions, but it's nothing even close to simple. There are many, many, many things that make it difficult to actually update predictions, including being metabolically encumbered in various ways. And that's something I talk about in 7.5 lessons about the brain. So we don't think very much about metabolism as being at the root of depression or PTSD or Alzheimer's disease, but it is. Actually, doesn't mean that it's the only cause, but there's a really important aspect that of learning that is very metabolically based. And if you are metabolically encumbered for any reason, whether it's that you don't have enough food, you don't get enough sleep, you're in a constant sea of uncertainty, or constantly you perceive yourself to be under threat, you're going to have trouble actually updating your predictions. What to do to help people adjust? I mean, the people who come to the United States from a war-torn country have many things they have to contend with. One is that they've just been through an adversity, so already their body budgets, their metabolism is probably running a deficit. They are usually economically encumbered, meaning that they don't have all the choices that they might have had back home. And this is a country, the United States is a country where you can't do very much for yourself if you don't have the money to do it, or somebody isn't there to help you. I mean, it's very challenging actually, to be I grew up actually in poverty, so I can tell you it's very challenging to climb your way out of that. But there are conceptual differences between the concepts that are used to interpret action and guide action and create feeling that are different from the United States. And so they have to learn those. And so I would say the best thing that you can do is be consistent, be repetitive and clear. That is, make it easy for them to ask you questions that otherwise might seem obvious, right? Like, I'm thinking, for example, things that we take for granted, you might invite them to actually ask you specific questions. So when we were helping some folks in Rhode Island, I'm going to stay on for a couple of minutes longer just to answer David's question here, just to let you know. But we were helping some people from the Congo acculturate to Rhode Island, to Providence, Rhode Island. And one of the things that I mean, we did all kinds of things to be helpful to them. We provided them with computers and taught them how to use those computers so the adults could try to find jobs. We showed them how to streamline their lives to, you know, like things that we just take for granted, like running to the grocery store and, you know, picking something up from the mail, you know, from the post office, or, you know, things we just sort of, you know, easily, automatically just make a plan for the day. But that's because we know where everything is and we know how to get everything we need. And we take a lot of those things for granted. But those kinds of things have to be made really explicit to people who aren't from here and who are from a really different culture than ours. And the other thing, so making things more obvious, looking at your day and asking, what are all the hidden contingencies I don't even pay attention to? These people probably have some real difficulties that are partly just due to their lack of familiarity. And then the other thing that we did was we would always start a conversation or a session in a way that was more familiar to them from their culture. And then we would talk about the comparisons to our culture. So for example, Afghanistan is a culture of honor. They have a culture of honor there. Some of the things that we might think of as joking, they might not think of as joking. And I would just call that out and say, well, in the US, so in the United States, if I shorten your name from, I'm going to pick an American name, but, you know, from Alexandra to Alex, that's not disrespectful. That's affection. And they're like, oh, okay. Right. So they, right. Yeah. So, or, you know, so basically giving them room to, inviting them explicitly to ask a lot of questions, to learn, to acculturate, basically to update their model. That's going to help them. It's going to reduce the difficulty in transitioning. And for those people who are actually experiencing trauma in terms of PTSD, they need professional help. PTSD does not remit on its own. You really need to have a combination of medication to help you learn, to help your brain metabolically adjust so it can learn the new contingencies, and they need to feel like they need sort of support, that is someone who's there to be supportive of them in a very reliable, unconditional way.
Okay, so David Wall.
Hi, Lisa, thank you for your presentation. As I was reading your TED Talk, or listening to your TED Talk, I was thinking that was, I mean, it made a lot of sense to me. It was just very, very intuitive, made sense. So my question was, it's great that 6.5 million people have seen it. Those of us now at Lamorinda have seen it. How do you get your message out to a broader audience so that jury selection, not the jury selection, but the jurors won't be looking at somebody's face in order to determine guilt and all that, all those examples? How do you get your message out?
Yeah, so that's a great question, David. Thank you for that question. We're being recorded, so for some of this, I'm going to be vague. Some of it I can't really. But for example, the Innocence Project recently came to me, and this is a project that tries to help people who are on death row mistakenly, who've been convicted and sentenced to death, where this team of lawyers believes that there's mitigating circumstances. So for example, the idea that, you know, in the TED Talk, I use the example of Dr. Tsarnaev and being, he's not being targeted, he's not, the Innocence Project hasn't hasn't contacted him at all. I mean, you know, he's clearly guilty. But the point is that some people actually are convicted and sometimes put on death row because jurors believe that they can read guilt and innocence and remorse in a face. And there's just no scientific evidence that anybody can do that. And that, or that AI could do that. That's just, it's just categorically not possible to do. Because people, you know, the evidence is really clear that the way that people express emotion is highly variable. It's not random, it's just highly contextual. And no AI and no human really is, in a courtroom, is usually skilled enough to understand those contingencies. So usually what I do is, one thing I do is write books. I'll be really honest with you that I'm a female scientist. So getting visibility for any books I write is really hard. It's much harder than if I were a man, which may sound like weasel words to you, but I can quite assure you that it's not. So I do many other things. I write newspaper articles for newspapers and magazines. They're all posted free. The ones I have access to, and that are in my, you know, in English, which I can read, are all posted on my website for free. Anybody can read them. I speak on many, 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 many podcasts. Those are also available for free, actually, on my website. The ones that I can put up on my website for free, I put up for free. I also consult to governments. So right now, the United States and Germany are the two that come to mind, are considering legislation about emotion AI, the ability for technology to read emotion in people's faces or their bodies or their brains. Even the Army comes to us on occasion for help, which we very much provide whenever it is related to the health and safety of soldiers and other military personnel who are being asked to put their lives on the line for us. So I also consult to the government occasionally. There are times I'm called on for legal purposes. In the Innocence Project, all I did was provide what's called framework testimony to the court. I don't do anything like expert witness. I never accept requests to be an expert witness because it's very hard to generalize the science of, you know, the studying groups of people to an individual case in an individual context. That's just super hard. So I don't tend to do that. And then I give talks, or I do question and answer sessions like this one to small groups of people. And sometimes I give big lectures, big public lectures to, you know, CEOs of companies, or, you know, big audiences with several thousand people in it. But I also think that it's important to talk to smaller groups like this one, because it allows people to ask questions. And so it's by a combination of these means. I frankly wish my reach was wider, frankly, mainly because I just think it's important to put scientific observations in the hands of people who can use them. Like, I don't really think that you should be looking at me or listening to me and saying, oh, she's an expert, so I'm going to do what she says. What I'm trying to do is, in my books and in the articles and so on, is present the evidence to you as I understand it. And then it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. In 7.5 lessons, there were a couple of times where, you know, I took my lab coat off and had something I wanted to personally say, you know, like about childhood poverty, for example, and its pernicious effect on developing brains. But most of the time, I'm just talking to people in one way or another. I don't answer very many emails just because I receive hundreds of them in a week. And I mean, I literally right now have something like 30,000 emails in my inbox, literally from the beginning of, I think, March, when I, cleared it out.
Thank you. May I ask a last question? This will be quick. Thank you, Dr. Barrett. Thank you so much. You're the reason I love organizing programs here. You've really been wonderful. Thank you. Here's my quickie. My background is aviation, military and commercial. The reason we only had one fatality in a decade between 2010 and 2020 is because of the very things you're talking about. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Equipment got better, human factors were exposed, and through repetition in simulators, all these possible problems, right?
Yeah.
You get a keen sense of things. You hear little things, they just jump out to you. Little changes in trend. You see trend, you see that, wait, that's not right. And question is, have you ever worked with anything in anyone in the industry, anyone involved in aviation? Number two, what industries would you love to get into to help? And that's it. Thank you again.
Thank you. I haven't worked directly with aviation in the aviation industry, although I did have a number of large commercial airline companies contact me to understand how the science could be used to better facilitate, consumer comfort, basically, or like to mitigate miscommunication between airline staff and customers. And I was really happy to help there. I think that the places where I would really like to have more influence, honestly, would be, I'd really like to talk to the people at the UN or the World Health Organization, particularly people who are dealing with kids in refugee camps. I think there are some really serious issues there. And people actually in governments here that are dealing with childhood poverty. Because I think when you understand that the brain is born under construction to really profound degree, and that a lot of the emotions and intentions that we ascribe to infants and young children, they just couldn't possibly have, given on the basis of but it's just, that's what we do with each other. And we become wired to do that, and they will too, but not when they're the littles like that. So I think that's one place. I think another place is, I'm really interested in emotion AI, and I just think it's going, the industries are, it's a $24 billion a year industry, and they're going about it in completely the wrong way, in a harmful way. The thing is, the technology is amazing. And if they were asking the right questions, there's no bad technology, there's no bad AI. It's just, you can use it to ask bad, stupid questions. But the technology is amazing and actually could really revolutionize our scientific understanding. So I'd really love to to be able to play a role in that. And I guess the third thing is, there's a huge wellness industry, and you'll forgive me when I say it's just full of bullshit, like really full of a lot of bullshit. But science and philosophy are tools for living. That's why we do what we do. And so there really is a way to, I don't want to tell people what to do. I want to give them the tools to make their own decisions. And part of that is understanding how to read a newspaper article or listen to a podcast and assess for yourself. Is this bullshit that I'm hearing, or is there really something to this? So I'm thinking about ways to do that. I'm not really sure, I haven't really figured out the best way to do that, but that's really something that I'm also really interested in. And I think with that, I'm going to have to say farewell because I'm 15 minutes late for my next appointment, but this was so much fun.